the feds, as in NRCan, Natural Resources Canada, have recently put out a request for information and in soliciting feedback for a Mind in Canada credential. And why I think this might be of interest to this group is just providing some opportunity to give some feedback to federal authorities on why a Mind in Canada credential might be of use or importance.
Cool.
Yeah, it's neat to see.
Well, if that's something that's easy for you to do, Brianna, if you could put the link in the chat or something, I'll make sure that sort of is shared with the group. It'll become part of the minutes of the meeting, I suppose. But yeah, if that's something that you can, if there's a link to that request for consultation or something, then fabulous. Let's have a look at how we might do it. I will now do a thing I forgot to do yesterday and share my screen. I got halfway through my little intro blurb and Sankashan reminded me that I wasn't sharing my screen, which I've done several times, serial offender. With no further ado, welcome to the UN CEFACT Global Trust Registry project. The meeting on today for me is Friday, the 20th of March in the morning, because I'm in Australia. Well, kind of the morning, it's nearly the end of the morning. This project is run under the UN CEFACT Code of Conduct and Ways of Working. The conditions basically around the intellectual property rights and the working collaboratively and so on, well known to those of us who are on the call right now. This is the same agenda we used yesterday, and it's probably going to be a standing agenda for the project sort of going forward. Basically, we're just going to kind of remind ourselves where we got to in the schedule, look at the things we've done since we last met, closed issues and closed merges and so on, and then look at the open issues and work to be done, if you like, that we want to cover, and then obviously leave an opportunity for any other business if we get the time to raise that. So the thing I started with yesterday was a quick reminder of kind of where we're at. So this is the markdown file that has the schedule, and that one just renders a bit more easily to read on the screen, I think. So the red line you can see in the middle is the now. And you can see I've got sort of three things that we're trying to work on at once. We've got this sort of pilot documentation stuff, which is, I think, subject to pilot people telling me that it needs to work on it. It's okay. Let's let Joe in. We've got two other sort of core documents, the grid business requirement specification, which is really the, we've got a document that's called the target operating model is the phrase that we've used for that. And then the DIA specification, this third thing here, is this idea about the digital identity anchor is currently curated by the UNTP, the United Nations Transparency Protocol. We're suggesting that it stays curated by them, by the way, but we give them feedback about how to update it if we think that's useful for both grid and for them. The deadline for that work I'm proposing in this chart is April 10, which isn't very far away. And that's partly because we need to give 60 days for public review, and then I've allowed for, if you like, an update after the public review, and then we sort of have a final publication, finalized documents on the end, at the end of July, 29th of July is what this shows. And the reason for all that is there's a possible that we will agree after these documents have been published, we may agree with UN CEFACT Bureau that there should be a recommendation. So the recommendation is this particular phrase that UN CEFACT use for documents that are then promulgated or sent out by the UN CEFACT to the UN member states as a recommendation for them to follow. So the last one I'm aware of is recommendation 49, which talked about the supply chain transparency and a number of other issues and made reference to UNTP. So this work we're doing right now is not a recommendation until or unless we agree that we'll need to produce one. So we produce these first documents and then we decide whether we do a recommendation or not. And that's what this schedule on here shows. And that would take us hopefully to get a result before the plenary, which is November of this year for UN CEFACT. So that's,
okay. Good.
That's the schedule. So it's sort of 3 weeks of intense effort to get to a documentation. The stuff that we've done recently, I was sharing last night that there's a the way the GitLab environment works is that there's whenever you do a change to the pages, the content, there's a commit process that you commit or you push in GitLab's environment, and that happens whenever you make any changes, whether or not there's a merge process. So if you created a separate branch and a fork and you're kind of doing some changes and you merge it, that's a fairly significant process, and it's tracked as well as a commit. A merge always involves a commit, but you can do a commit without a merge. And therefore, if you want to look at all the things that have happened since the last meeting, they'll be in these commit things. And you can see that some of the things are right kind of trivial, like I added minutes of a meeting and I moved old minutes to a folder. That's just me doing some admin stuff to add in the minutes and move things around, but it involves a commit. And I realized there's a button that needed a date change. So those are really trivial kind of changes, but there are other more important ones that are also in here about merging branch 41. This was a particularly large issue around getting our original project brief deliverables mapped to the work we're currently doing. Have we met the requirements of the original project brief in what we're doing? How, if so, how? What mapping do we have from the original project brief to this new set of work that we're producing? So that's the commits. So everybody can have a look at those. And the same is true for merges. There are sort of merged changes that have happened. You can see that's the same as the commit that you just saw, and tidying up some files and so on. The thing that's more interesting to discuss is open issues. That's what we did pretty well. All of yesterday's meeting was focused on these. As a quick heads up, this implementation guidelines is a recognition that we need to have a document which goes some way to describing how grid might be implemented and how registrars might do their work. Now, some of that idea and thinking is inside the pilot documentation. Describes how pilots might work, but it needs a separate treatment. Alina's put a hand up to sort of work on that document, and what this issue is kind of like a placeholder for producing that document, a reminder that we need to produce that document. The other issues are kind of, some of them are more substantive. So this is the issue, the proposed changes to the UNTP DIA spec is the issue where we're concentrating the discussion around if and how. If we change the DIA spec, how and why would we change it? What's the benefit of changing it? What do we need to do? And that's got a fairly lengthy treatment in terms of the issue description. And then it's got a very, if you read through this, a very active discussion with a number of people around pros and cons of various treatments and various ideas. What we were really centering on, Brianna, was this idea of whether or not a digital identity anchor should have more than one identifier in it. So if you take a registrar like the Spanish registrar, they are able to both issue a commercial sort of business identifier, so they can register businesses, and give a Spanish business identifier. But they are also, being part of Europe, and they are also able to give you an EU ID, a kind of a business identifier that's part of the European business wallet kind of structure and so on. And they're a local operating unit under GLIFE, which means that they can give you, for a fee, a legal entity identifier, LEI. So using them as an example, and if one company were to apply for all three, do they give you one DIA with 3 identifiers in it, or do they issue 3 DIAs? So we chewed around that idea for quite a while, and we, I think, have landed on the basic on the idea that these DIAs should be as simple as possible. So we don't want to multiply include things unnecessarily. So it's not really a cost impact, particularly to issue 3 DIAs or to issue 1 DIA with 3 things in it. These are electronic things. They're not particularly onerous or costly to produce. But we felt that there was more flexibility if the DIAs were separately issued, so more flexibility in use and some other things. And then, of course, another part of this conversation was, if we scroll down here, was around things like the DIDs that are inside the digital identity anchor, and whether or not an organization might provide more than one DID, whether they might provide the same DID to different registrars. So if they're a farmer, they register their farm, they register their land, they register their business name, and so on. They use the same DID, perhaps. So their DID doc then contains all of the things to do with them as a farm, or maybe they use more than one DID. And there's a bit of a discussion around if they use more than one DID, is that a problem? How would we know they've used more than one DID? Is it possible for a registrar to know this DID has been used? Well, there's a whole bunch of interesting conversations about what's possible and what's not. And in the end, we've decided that we can't really preclude, or nor should we, an organization from using the same DID multiple times in their registration. That's just a thing. But we could look at the DID doc, and if there was something in there that the registrar doesn't like, they could make a comment to the owner to say, actually, I've noticed you've got this in there already. Perhaps you would like to use a different DID or whatever. So there's, anyway, bunch of if you're technically minded, a bunch of very interesting conversations about DIDs and DIAs and other things inside this issue. And that will realize the final sort of advice back to UNTP about what you should include in the DIA. The other two things were ISO standards on the that might affect the DIA. And so we had a very good presentation by Mark Lazar. I don't think you were with us on that call, Brianna, but Mark Lazar is in Canada. He's been working for a decade, well, at least a decade, on consent and consent management with the Kantara and other organizations. And there's an ISO standard that he's one of the primary authors of, the ISO 27560. And it's all about consent records. Now, he was reminding us of the importance of recorded and verifiable, I suppose, consent for individuals in terms of when their personal information is exchanged. And we've discussed over a bit of time about whether that is an issue within trade documents. And I think you could obviously draw a line along the thinking that says any trade document that references a person by kind of intent or explicitly, it has a degree of personal information in it. But what I've suggested in this issue is that whilst we would, personally, I would recommend that ISO standard is used and taken note of by organizations. It's not for the grid and DIAs to mandate its inclusion. In fact, in many instances, and most, it's not relevant to the DIA spec or to UNTP. So it's a kind of like, if it's relevant, then yes, you should pay attention to this. If it's not relevant, then obviously you don't. So that's the kind of landing. And Sankashan's also thought about it and given his sort of thoughts here, but anybody else is welcome to consider. But at the moment, what we're saying is we note it, we think it's important for individuals. We don't think it's actually directly relevant to the work we're doing for trade documentation. And that's the way we'll close it in a week's time, unless somebody voices up and says, no, that's wrong, and you need to think of it this way. The other issue that's more relevant is this 8000, ISO 80116. Had you heard of ISO 80116, Brianna? Is that a standard you've come across? Oh, you're on mute, sorry. Oh, still on mute.
Sorry. Talking and wasn't paying attention. Yes, you provided in the document some research that you did using some AI, talking about those two, and I did have a chance to skim through, looking at 800116, and yeah, I scanned it. I don't feel like I have anything. I have the chance to really think through some of this and provide some commentary. I do. So there's two things for me. One, the very first thing is looking sort of for the balance of scope for a minimum viable product, and what's the objective for a DIA in terms of global supply chains, right? So I'm in agreement that some of the personal identity stuff does not apply. However, I think it's really important to consider hidden costs around like membership or access points, or like a big part of the protocol is to be decentralized and to enable access. And then the third thing that stuck out to me about that was that something's already in existence and use. It's and somewhat at scale. and we can repurpose that to test out the ideas that we have around minimum viable product. That's probably smart.
Mhm. Yes, yes, I think I agree with all those points. So that looking just at the ISO 18116, it was new to me. I've now known of it for 36 hours, I think, and which is sort of embarrassing in some respects, given it's a very simple standard, and actually what it does is what we will have to do with GRID anyway. So GRID, the Global Registrar Information Directory, by its own sort of design, is concerned or interested in UN member states, countries, as we often call them. And that means, of course, there's a country code.
Right. But that code, wasn't there something that I read about the code being managed by a different group?
We'll get there. We'll get there. Right. So the country code is also an ISO standard, and country codes, in a sense, are managed by the UN. So if there's a new country created in the world, then the list of countries and their sort of 2- and 3-letter abbreviations is added to. And if a country is, I don't know, removed, I don't know what the phrase is for this, but if a country no longer exists, then their code is superseded or retired in some sense. And there are mechanisms for doing that, actually, interestingly enough, in the list of countries. So that's okay. That's all UN. Now, this standard has 3 parts to it. The UN, the country code, dot, registrar string, identifier, I suppose, dot, identifier. So it's a prefix for the identifier that the registrar would normally release anyway. So in Australia, we have an ABN number, which is, I think, something like a 9-digit number, but it's just a number, unique within Australia as an Australian business number. If it were released as an ISO 18116 string, it would be au.asic. Then your ABN number.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is GRID has to understand which countries are in the GRID. So there's already a country code. It also wants to understand which registrars a UN member state has proposed are part of this thing. So there's every reason why we might want to use that existing string that describes a registrar, because we're going to have to create one, even if they don't have one. It's like it's a necessary thing for us to think about. And then we've already said that we leave their identifier alone, which is the same as the standard does.
Yeah.
The thing I realized was that second element of this standard, the registrar string, is managed by ECMMA. I think I've got that in this text further down here. I'll open up the thing. The ECMMA is a not-for-profit organization which is responsible for this part of these codes. It's like INSEE here or ASIC here, and registrars voluntarily give their sort of name of the registrar and their code to it. So why that's interesting stroke slightly worrying is that if we rely upon the ISO 18116, we've got a sort of a dependency on another third party, but a dependency on ECMMA as a sort of necessary participant in a sense in what we're doing. So that was my caution in this discussion here, is this idea that if we do this, then there's a sort of hidden interesting thing around this use of ECCMA and what that might mean. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing or a risk. I have no axe to grind with ECCMA, but it's at least interesting.
Yeah, for me, like I thought it met a lot of the criteria of what you were looking for. If you wanted and noted concerns, but again, like the first minimum viable product, if it meets the majority or
yeah. I'm Joe knows this very well. We both are fans of not reinventing wheels and go with the flow. Just pick your battles. And another way of thinking about it. We don't need to create. We're very much trying to ensure the message is consistent. We are not creating a new identifier. We're not creating a new universal standard for things. We want to sort of make use of what exists.
But one thing that I would say is that you're gonna use existing existing mechanisms or identifiers. What you are adding is a new process in which to verify or
Yes.
a did against an identity. That's
Yes, you are. Yes, yeah. And that's a very, very important point, because that goes to, that point you're making goes to what we know in advance registrars will need to consider about their kind of operating and business model. So the Registradores of Spain has an established role, responsibility, and operating model where certain fees are charged for certain services. Issuance of registration issuance is a fee, but also searches and confirmation of data. And that's somewhat consistent with Australia. If you do what's called an ASIC search in a company, you pay, I don't know what it is, a $19 fee or a $25. There are fees associated with getting certain levels of detail. Now, that you can understand if you're running an organization like that, it costs money to employ people and to run systems. But what's interesting is if you publish this as a verifiable credential, as a DIA, the holder, the controller of this doesn't necessarily need to. It's a self-contained proof, right? So where does the commercial value come in? So there's some very good answers to those questions, but they do demand a consideration about how you might adjust your existing models, if and how. I think with the Spanish example, and that's also actually why the simplest DIA is probably the best. So if you've only given the identifier of the organization and proof that it was in fact registered by registradores, there will likely be other questions organizations want to answer. So they will likely still make use of the services of registradores to find out more about the company than just the identifier. It's not sufficient probably for a lot of due diligence type things that companies might do on each other. But anyway, there's a conversation in Slack also with Steve Capel around just this morning, very early in my morning, at least 1 a.m. in the morning. I think he's in another part of the world right now, around that ISO 8000 series. But we then got into the kind of the guts of the discussion was around the definitions we're using for register, registrar, and the digital identity anchor itself. And you'll see in some of these, I've added a kind of common kind of request, I suppose, which is that make sure you've availed yourself of, become aware of the existing work on these topics. So don't just sort of go in blind and sort of say, well, I think this should be the definition. Do the work, I suppose, of reading into the topic. I've also made a plea that we should make these things as simple as we can, no simpler, but as simple as we can, and that eligibility requirements should be included in the eligibility requirements, not in the definition. So we define what a register is, what a registrar is, and then we say to be a registrar in the grid, you need to meet the following eligibility requirements. So that hopefully makes us able to write a very simple definition and then separate out the requirements for eligibility. So that was where, when I saw this approach proposed, I sort of felt, well, we can probably simplify this quite a lot, because it includes a bunch of things to do with the way work is expected to be done and the meaning of work that's going to be done and all sorts of other things. And those are necessary for registrars that become part of the grid, but perhaps we don't need them in the definition of what a registrar is, and we separate it out. So that actually, yesterday, Alina, who had only had half an hour to read what I'd written because of the time zones, was initially, and I think still is at the moment, supportive of that approach. So she hadn't thought of it that way. It sort of worked for her, I think. So hopefully we'll see ourselves move along that path of very simple definitions and revisiting the eligibility requirements as necessary to make sure that they're sharp enough.
Yeah, that's promising. Comments. I think that because you folks are in the weeds, right, and you are thinking very deeply about these things, it's and they're complex, and you're thinking about all of the layers and the questions, as well as building something that you want to be useful and helpful and achieve, the project deliverables and build something that can be improved upon. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is be simple.
There's some really, thank you. There's some really well-known phrases, aren't there, about it's very hard to get to simple. And Joe and I are fans of, there's a drawing we use often in presentations that's a squiggle diagram where there's a sort of line coming in saying, I thought this was going to be simple. And there's this wild bird's nest of misdirections. Then out the other side is, oh, now it's simple again. But you have to go through all the mess of thinking before you can make it simple. And that's what we're doing, I suppose. So I want to, since Anne's joined us, I want to go to one of the issues Anne commented on. I think it was the second one in this list as it's shown here, and made a really good point, which became part of our conversation yesterday, Anne, actually. So Anne was raising the observation that there are ideas that perhaps we need to consider including in the discussion around registers and registrars, to do with things like public accessibility and some other things. So let me think. So public and trusted, and a legally empowered official, and so on. So those are terms that I think are very useful, and but not but and that goes to the idea that these could be useful additions to the eligibility criteria if they're not there already, and we keep the definition of the term reasonably simple, but we sort of separate the separation of duties, I suppose. So the term becomes as simply defined as it can be. The eligibility requirements where we put in the useful additions. That point you raised there triggered a very interesting conversation about accessibility and public. So Alina from Registradores in Spain explained that there is a legal requirement for the registers of registradores to be public, but interestingly enough, they charge a fee for access, right? So that's an interesting thing, right? I guess it's public, but you have to pay to see it. So that's a statement of truth. That's the way it is. And then one of the things about GRID is that we're not trying to change the truth. We're just trying to reflect what exists. So the fact that there's a fee to be paid is maybe something that becomes part of the GRID table, but it's still the public register. So we went through a number of discussions. Very usefully, I think, Sankeshan raised another perspective here, which is that a registrar, in my most simple definition, is this idea of the body that's responsible for a register, and a register is the list of things that they maintain. The addition that Sankeshan is making is the idea of operator. So I gave yesterday an example that's local to us in Victoria, in the state of Victoria in Australia, which is that our Victorian state government sold, under a temporary basis, the operating responsibility of Vic Roads, the vehicle licensing and a driving license authority of the state of Victoria. So a banking group called Macquarie purchased that for no small sum of money, and they are now, for at least the next 10 years, if not more, responsible for running driving licenses and vehicle licensings in Victoria. But the authority to do so still vests with the Victorian government. The legal responsibility, if you like, is a Victorian driving license. It's not a Macquarie Bank driving license. So it's a really useful addition to the thinking or recognition that there's a thing called a registrar operator. And just before Joe and I were talking about whether or not we need to include this in our terminology and thinking about GRID, my efforts to stay as simple as I can, but no simpler, is I think that's a statement of truth and fact about the way registrars often operate. But we, as the GRID, may not need to know about that. It's their business, right? We take you tell us you're the registrar, we'll accept that. You are the legally authority upon which registers are maintained. You can subcontract and outsource and do whatever you damn well like, but you're the registrar.
If I could add, I think the reason why I add that comment, because I was actually looking at, and I wonder, because we're talking about registry and public, and I was thinking, is there any private registry? And I think that's where I started, and I think I looked and I found the word registry was used. And again, the entity, I need to pull up all the information. It looks like it's a legal organization. This is not like an illegal one. It's a legal organization. And I'm pretty sure this probably set it up at NGO. But then I don't know if that is then a public
Yeah.
registry, or is it now still private?
Yeah, very good points, right? And we kind of had a bit of that discussion yesterday about the word subject, because the word subject appears in the technical definition of the Digital Identity Act. And Joe, I know you got your hand up, so I'll be there in a sec. The subject word has meaning in law, certain law at least, that is different to the way we're using it in the Digital Identity Anchor specification. The term registrar, register, registry, all of those have meaning. And I made the rather facile point that the word trust is particularly burdensome in a legal sense, because trust can mean all sorts of things, including a system set up by a family, for example, a family trust or whatever else. So all the words we use, particularly in English, have many meanings. And that's the single purpose of the glossary, is for those words that are particularly important, to say what that word means in our documentation, not in the world, not being so arrogant that this means that for everybody everywhere, but within our documentation, when we use this word, we mean this. And that's what we're doing. So it is true that public registries exist. The question is whether or not we need to pay any attention to that in our documentation that we have, and we do if it becomes important for people to understand our documents. So it's sort of we're doing this balance all the time around as simple as possible but no simpler, as few terms as possible but no fewer, all that sort of stuff, right? And therefore I think your points are very good. And I think what I'd like to do with what you put in the comment there, Anne, is revisit the eligibility requirements to see what do we need to do to sharpen those, if any, to say, look, to be eligible, actually you're going to make sure that this stuff is actually publicly accessible, whether the fee pay or not. Joe,
I agree with that. Thank you. Yeah,
no problem. Joe, you've been patient. Thank you.
No, that's absolutely fine. Can you hear me? Okay, no, I hope you can. The channel, and I was really pleased to get that comment from Sanction. I think it's absolutely right that not every registry will be able to operate on its own, and I think it's critical that we enable registries to use, operating units or operating service providers to actually help them get up and running. That doesn't need to be visible at the front. That the only thing that we need to be able to do is to be able to get various different registries into the grid and usable by those people that want to use the grid and the services it provides. That's really critical. From an operations perspective, we may need to understand what the roles and responsibilities of the people involved are, and where we get the necessary content or information from each registry, or might be just the public keys, those public keys associated with those registries, so that we can publish them for use and verification of DIAs that are published by those registries. So in essence, what I'm saying is, I agree with you, John, that we don't need to make the, if you like, the operational processes for each registry visible, but in practical terms, in terms of the implementation, the operating model, we may need to understand that there are people and organizations that are enabling registries to become members of the grid or accessible via the grid.
I think you're right, Joe. I think where I see that becoming a topic to be explained or discussed is in the implementation guidelines, and the reason it becomes really important is key management. So there is an expectation, if you're going to do any of this stuff, that if you're a registrar issuing digital identity anchors and using verifiable credentials and whatever, basically you've got a whole bunch of key management stuff to do. And part of that, the part we want them to do is to issue DIAs signed with their private key and give us the public key that we can put in the grid. Therefore, that people then can sort of check that it was from them. But that involves key management on their side. And if they've delegated responsibility to operations to another party, they need to understand that actually this key management thing is you'll have to think about how you do key management now.
Yeah. Because you're delegating all of that out, and then there's a risk scenario.
Yeah. And we've both saying, Joe and I have both seen that happen at state level in New South Wales of Australia, where a body in the government, Service New South Wales, became responsible for issuing a whole bunch of credentials that are signed certificates, cryptographically signed, and from on behalf of other departments. So that becomes interesting because, well, who's controlling the keys? Yeah, it's a Brianna's just given a response, but so what our observation was, from a thought experiment or a very obvious perspective, is if we take a birth certificate which has just gone live recently in New South Wales, the authority rests with New South Wales births, deaths and marriages for issuing a birth certificate. They are the absolute authority. They are responsible for making sure that a birth is correctly recorded and a birth certificate is duly issued to the right party. New South Wales, Service New South Wales is not a birth, deaths and marriage registrar. So who owns the keys, right? And what key is used? So that then becomes a really interesting question, and it actually goes to the heart of the meaning of these certificates as well. Because if Service New South Wales were to sign it with their key, that means Service New South Wales has said this is a birth certificate from New South Wales birth, deaths and marriages, but it doesn't have the same legal significance in some ways as if birth, deaths and marriages were to issue it themselves. So it's necessary to include the implementation guidelines because they need to think about this stuff. But like I guess with many of these issues, we can't dictate how they do it. We can only ask that we get a certain thing from them. And that's we'll given the implementation guidelines hopefully some good advice about things to think about and how to avoid sort of pitfalls. But it's sort of interesting, more than interesting. It's essential. So those are those three are the very active ones. We had a very active discussion on the digital identity anchor. You'll notice in this issue there's the best formatted issue comments award goes to Hans Huber because he's done this sort of very clear kind of structure and everything else in terms of his issue and suggestions, and I've done my best to sort of in a rather free format way answer and think about it. So this is still sort of a bit live. What he's really pointing out is a really important understanding. I think on this call we're all familiar with verifiable credential, the verifiable credential data model from W3C, and it's got this concept of the subject of the verifiable credential can be different to the holder, the organization or individual that it's been issued to. So it might be that a farmer has a credential that recognizes their farm, the subject is the farm, but the holder is the farmer or the company that owns the farm. And what Hans has done in here is to sort of tease about and think about how does that sort of thinking work inside the digital identity anchor specification and what do we need to be careful about. So that's a bit of a live discussion still, and we're sort of working our way through that. I encourage everybody to read it if you want to get involved. Well, I think it's incredibly interesting. Others may not find it so interesting. And then the last one, I think, Sankashan and I think we can close something today. So this issue was one raised. In fact, Sankashan, are you able to talk? Because I feel like I should give others.
Right. It's not that early yet. It started early in my time. Yeah, I think we should close this. I think this has been addressed in a very comprehensive manner at this point. It is likely we are going to require another similar review once we have the documents updated and before we make the payload ready for the CEFACT review. But this particular issue, I guess we can close this.
So thanks, Sankashan. So I will press that button in a moment. Just for the audience, and the record, this is like a meta issue. So what we did was we bundled a whole bunch of comments that we'd received in review of the website into one issue with a whole bunch of tasks to complete to close those points that had been raised. And as you can see, we declare ourselves, and we're marking our own homework that we finished those tasks, and therefore we feel now we can close the issues. There you go, click the close issue. So if we now go issue list, we'll have one less. Yay. So that's it. That was what we went through yesterday, with more obviously interaction and conversation, different conversations. The minutes are already up from yesterday's meeting, as is the recording on our YouTube playlist thing. Thoughts and comments from participants today? If that, oh, go on.
I don't have a question, I mean comments, but more of a question. So I think we already now near the end of March. So the timeline, we okay with having documents? I believe Steve would mention some. The next meeting, I believe, is at early May, right?
Yes, we'll quickly revisit the schedule discussion. We sort of led with that a little. So the red line on the screen now, if you can see it, is now. So this is the 6th meeting of the year where we're running right now, and you can see these are every 2 weeks all the way down, and we're working on these tasks here. Now, my ambitious goal is to have a sort of draft review ready on the 10th of April. And that was the request for people participating in yesterday's meeting was, please read the issues that exist right now and do your best to your own satisfaction. Comment on the issue so that you feel it's resolved as best you can by Thursday of next week, my time, so that we've got time then to decide how to address the issue, and then in 2 weeks' time we can close hopefully the issues based on the suggested changes. So like the merges, if you like, that we put forward. So we've got quite a tight deadline to get to the release of these documents for review. But the sanity checks are, these don't need to be perfect. They need to be good enough for the CEFACT Bureau to review them, and more importantly, for the CEFACT Bureau to agree, this is really good stuff, important, we need to do more of this, and to agree what the next steps are, if you like. There need to be a compelling argument to do the next piece. The next pieces could be write a recommendation. That's an option that we put into the schedule that starts, you'll notice this is sort of later, so that the now isn't even on this chart yet. This graph starts in May. So we could write a recommendation. That's a loaded term in CEFACT Bureau terminology. It means that you've got to get a certain rigor, and all the countries in the world receive this recommendation as something that we propose is done. So there's a bit more substance to the review process and other things, and it takes a bit more time. So it's an and to the documents that we're currently producing, and it's an and that we decide if or not to do after we've done our current work. And that would take us to the plenary in November. Which would be the sort of aimed for deadline. The other, I guess, piece of work that's ongoing is this idea of pilots and sort of continuing the pilot process, which you can sort of see I've indicated as continuous bars at the bottom of these two schedules.
That looks wonderful. Thank you very much. This is phenomenal work. And I apologize for joining late. I think the daytime saving just completely messed up my schedule.
It messed me up too, and I was expecting to start at 12 my time, and it was 11. I'm grateful. I've got things to do today, so I'm an hour ahead. But yes, and apologies to all for the next 2 weeks. The world decides to change its daylight savings times at different times and in different directions during the next few weeks, so just stay awake, because it's going to be wild for the meetings for a while.
Yeah. Thank you.
Very welcome. I guess unless there's any other questions or comments, I'm very happy to close at the time, which is 10 to the hour. And thank you all. I will get the minutes up and ready, published in a few hours or over the weekend or something. Thank you all again.
Great stuff. Well done, Joe. Well done.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.